In the sprawling compound of one of Seoul's most feared crime families, Keisha Williams moved through shadows and silence, invisible to everyone who mattered until the day a simple bandage changed everything. For 18 months, she had perfected the art of being overlooked, cleaning around men who controlled the city's underground while they discussed territories and debts as casually as the weather. But Lee Junho, the family's cold and calculating don, noticed everything in his domain. And on this particular morning, he would notice her. At 24, Keisha balanced the impossible weight of survival with the crushing burden of responsibility. She had been 3 months away from graduating nursing school when her father's cancer diagnosis arrived like a sledgehammer to her carefully constructed future. The medical bills consumed her savings, her scholarship, and her dreams in a matter of weeks. Now she worked as a maid in the Lee family compound, earning enough to keep her father in treatment while living in a world where one wrong glance could end her life. Her dark skin stood out in the predominantly Korean household, but that visibility was precisely what made her valuable. No one suspected the foreign cleaning girl of understanding anything important. The Lee estate sprawled across 15 acres in Seoul's most exclusive district, hidden behind walls that could stop a tank and gates that opened for only the most dangerous men in Asia. Every surface gleamed with the kind of wealth that came from controlling shipping routes, protection rackets, and the gray markets that existed in the spaces between legal and lethal. Keisha moved through this fortress of luxury with practiced invisibility, her cleaning cartwheels silent on marble floors that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The other staff, all Korean, treated her with polite indifference. They had learned long ago that curiosity about the family's business was a luxury no one could afford. The household hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. Mrs. Park, the head housekeeper, commanded the domestic staff with military precision. The security team answered only to Captain Kim, a former Special Forces operator whose loyalty to the family was absolute. The kitchen staff prepared meals that could feed 30, but never asked who would be eating. And above them all, like a king in his castle, was Lee Junho, the don who had transformed his father's modest criminal enterprise into an empire that stretched across 3 countries. This particular morning, Keisha was assigned to clean the 3rd floor, where the family conducted business that required absolute privacy. She had learned to time her work carefully, arriving early enough to finish before the important meetings began. The conference room was a study in understated power, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a massive mahogany table that could seat 20, and walls lined with art that most museums would kill to acquire. As she dusted the intricate carvings on the table legs, she could hear voices approaching from the hallway. Lee Junho entered first, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. At 36, he was a study in controlled intensity, dressed in a charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection that probably cost more than Keisha made in 6 months. His sharp features and cold dark eyes missed nothing, and his presence commanded instant respect and barely concealed fear from everyone around him. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, every gesture calculated and precise. Behind him came 5 other men, all wearing expensive suits but none carrying themselves with his effortless authority. Keisha kept her head down and her movements slow, hoping to finish her work and disappear before the meeting began in earnest. She had witnessed enough conversations in this room to know that the Lee family's business dealings were conducted with the same efficiency and ruthlessness that had made them legends in Seoul's underworld. Territory disputes were settled with phone calls. Debts were collected with surgical precision. Competitors simply disappeared. "Take a seat," Junho said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command. The men arranged themselves around the table while Keisha continued cleaning, grateful for her invisibility. She understood enough Korean to follow basic conversations, but she kept that knowledge carefully hidden. The foreign maid who spoke only English was far less threatening than one who could comprehend every word spoken in her presence. The conversation that followed was typical of what she had overheard before. Shipping schedules, payment collections, territorial boundaries. One of the men, nervous and sweating despite the room's perfect climate control, reported a problem with a rival family encroaching on their warehouse district. Another discussed a politician who needed additional persuasion to support certain legislation. Junho listened without expression, occasionally asking questions that revealed the depth of his understanding and the reach of his influence. Keisha finished dusting the table and moved to clean the windows, keeping her back to the men and her ears carefully tuned to the conversation. She had learned that information was valuable, even if she never intended to use it. Understanding the family's business helped her navigate the household politics and avoid the dangerous mistakes that could cost her job or worse. The Kim family thinks they can move product through our territory without permission, the nervous man continued. They've been testing our response, small shipments at first, but yesterday they moved a full truck through the Eastern District. Junho's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air. The other men straightened slightly, recognizing the signs of their leader's displeasure. "How long has this been happening?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. 3 weeks, maybe 4. We weren't sure if it was intentional or just sloppy planning on their part. There was a long silence. Keisha continued cleaning the windows, but she could feel the tension building behind her. In her 18 months with the family, she had learned to read the atmosphere like a barometric pressure system. When Junho went silent, something dangerous was about to happen. "Set up a meeting with Kim Sang-min," Junho finally said. "Tell him I want to discuss our mutual interests. Make it clear that this is not a request." The men nodded, understanding the implications. Keisha finished the windows and began gathering her supplies, eager to leave before the conversation took a darker turn. As she lifted her cleaning cart, one of the wheels caught on the thick Persian rug, and the entire cart tilted dangerously. She lunged forward to steady it, but several bottles of cleaning solution crashed to the floor, their contents spreading across the expensive carpet. The room went completely silent. Keisha's heart hammered against her ribs as she dropped to her knees, frantically trying to clean up the spill with her bare hands. She could feel 6 pairs of eyes watching her, but she didn't dare look up. In a household where respect and protocol were everything, her clumsiness was not just embarrassing, but potentially dangerous. "Leave it," Junho said quietly. His voice carried no anger, but the command was absolute. Keisha froze, her hands still reaching for the spilled bottles. "Everyone out except you," he added, and she realized with growing terror that he was talking to her. The other men filed out of the room without a word, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Keisha remained on her knees, staring at the ruined carpet and wondering if this was how her employment with the Lee family would end. She had seen what happened to people who disappointed Junho, and it never ended well for anyone involved. "Stand up," he said. His tone was neither harsh nor gentle, simply commanding. Keisha rose slowly, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. She could feel his gaze on her, evaluating, measuring. The silence stretched between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. "Look at me," he said. It was not a request. Keisha lifted her eyes and met his dark gaze for the first time since she had started working for his family. His face was unreadable, but she caught something in his expression that she hadn't expected. Not anger or disappointment, but a kind of careful assessment, as if he was seeing her for the first time. "What is your name?" he asked, though she was certain he already knew the answer. The Lee family kept detailed files on every person who worked in their compound. "Keisha Williams, sir," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you worked here, Keisha Williams?" 18 months, sir." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. She realized that this was the longest conversation she had ever had with him, and possibly the most dangerous moment of her employment. In the Lee household, being noticed by the Don was rarely a good thing. "You understand that what you hear in this room stays in this room," he said. It was not a question, but she nodded anyway. "Good. Clean this up and continue with your work. And Keisha," he added as she turned to leave, "be more careful with the furniture. Some things in this house are irreplaceable." She nodded again and hurried from the room, her heart still racing from the encounter. As she gathered her supplies and headed for the supply closet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just changed. For 18 months, she had been invisible in the Lee household, just another piece of the carefully orchestrated machinery that kept the family's empire running smoothly. But now Lee Junho knew her name, and in a world where invisibility was safety, being seen by the most dangerous man in Seoul was either the best thing that could happen to her or the worst. 3 days after the conference room incident, Keisha was assigned to clean the upper floors of the estate, a task that typically took most of the morning due to the sheer size and opulence of the family's private quarters. The fourth floor housed guest bedrooms that rivaled five-star hotel suites, each decorated with antiques and artwork that belonged in museums rather than private homes. She moved methodically from room to room, her cleaning cart wheels whisper quiet on the thick carpeting that absorbed every sound. The morning had started like any other. Mrs. Park had given her the assignment with her usual brisk efficiency, reminding her to be extra careful around the Ming Dynasty vase in the blue guest room and to ensure the crystal chandelier in the main hallway was dusted thoroughly. Keisha had learned to appreciate these solo assignments on the upper floors. The isolation gave her time to think, to process the strange encounter with Lee Junho, and to wonder what it meant that he now knew her name. She was cleaning the windows in the corner guest room when the first alarm sounded. It was a low, pulsing tone that she had never heard before, different from the fire alarm or the standard security alerts that occasionally interrupted the household routine. Within seconds, she could hear running footsteps in the corridors below and the sharp bark of Captain Kim's voice issuing commands to his security team. Keisha froze at the window, her cloth still pressed against the glass. Through the pane, she could see men in dark clothing moving along the estate's perimeter wall, their movements coordinated and purposeful. These weren't delivery personnel or maintenance workers. These were intruders, and they were advancing on the main house with military precision. The sound of shattering glass echoed from somewhere below, followed immediately by shouts and the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Keisha's blood turned to ice. She had heard stories from the other staff about attacks on rival families, whispered tales of home invasions and assassination attempts that left entire households dead. But those stories had always seemed distant, like news reports from a world that existed parallel to her own mundane reality of cleaning and cooking and keeping her head down. She abandoned her cleaning supplies and moved toward the hallway, unsure whether to hide or try to find the rest of the staff. The security protocols had been explained to all household employees during their first week, but the information seemed useless now that she actually needed it. Lock the doors, stay away from windows, don't leave your assigned area until given the all-clear. But what if the all-clear never came? The gunfire below intensified, and she could hear Captain Kim's voice over the estate's intercom system, speaking rapid Korean that she could only partially understand. Something about positions and containment and maintaining the perimeter. The professional calm in his voice was somehow more terrifying than panic would have been. This was not his first time coordinating the defense of the Lee compound. Keisha pressed herself against the hallway wall, trying to decide whether to retreat to one of the guest rooms or attempt to reach the service stairway that would take her down to the staff quarters. The main staircase was too exposed, too visible from the ground floor where the battle seemed to be concentrated. But the service stairs were at the opposite end of the hallway, requiring her to cross 30 feet of open corridor. She was halfway to the service entrance when the massive chandelier above her head exploded in a shower of crystal and metal. The decorative fixture, worth more than she would make in 5 years, came crashing down in pieces that scattered across the hallway like deadly confetti. Keisha threw herself against the nearest wall, but she wasn't fast enough to avoid every shard. A piece of crystal, sharp as a blade and the size of her palm, caught her across the left side of her face, opening a gash that ran from her temple to her cheekbone. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, followed by the warm rush of blood that seemed to pour from the wound faster than should have been possible. She pressed her hand against her face, feeling the sticky warmth seep between her fingers, and realized that she was probably going to need medical attention that the estate's first aid kit couldn't provide. The gunfire below had stopped, replaced by the kind of tense quiet that suggested the immediate threat had been neutralized. Keisha could hear boots on the main staircase, voices calling out in Korean, the sound of doors being opened and searched. Captain Kim's security team was sweeping the house, ensuring that no intruders had made it past the ground floor defenses. She stumbled toward the service stairs, leaving a trail of blood drops on the expensive carpet. Her face felt like it was on fire, and the wound was deep enough that she could feel the air moving across exposed tissue every time she breathed. She needed help, but she also understood that the security team's priority was protecting the family, not treating the injured cleaning staff. By the time she reached the ground floor, The immediate crisis had passed. The intruders had been repelled, their attempt to breach the estate's defenses unsuccessful. Captain Kim was coordinating with the local police, though Keisha suspected that the official report would bear little resemblance to what had actually occurred. The Lee family had arrangements with various government agencies that ensured their privacy was respected even during emergencies. The other household staff had gathered in the main kitchen, following the established protocols for post-incident assembly. Mrs. Park was taking roll call, ensuring that all domestic employees were present and accounted for. When she saw Keisha stumble through the kitchen doorway, her face covered in blood and her uniform torn, the older woman's expression barely changed. "You're bleeding on the floor," Mrs. Park said, her tone suggesting that this was Keisha's most pressing concern. "Go to the staff bathroom and clean yourself up. We can't have blood track through the house when the police arrive." Keisha nodded weakly, understanding that sympathy wasn't part of Mrs. Park's job description. She made her way toward the staff quarters, her hand still pressed against the bleeding wound, when she heard a voice behind her that made every person in the kitchen freeze. "What happened to her?" Lee Junho said. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath the words that suggested genuine concern. Keisha turned slowly, aware that every pair of eyes in the kitchen was now focused on her blood-streaked face and torn uniform. Junho stood in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his morning suit, but with his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled from whatever role he had played in defending the compound. His dark eyes took in her injury with the same careful assessment she had seen 3 days earlier, but now there was an intensity to his gaze that hadn't been there before. "She was on the 4th floor when the chandelier fell," Mrs. Park explained, her tone suggesting that Keisha's presence during the attack was somehow problematic. "Cut by the glass. She'll clean up and be back to work within the hour." "No," Junho said quietly. His tone brooked no argument. "She needs medical attention. Call Dr. Yoon. Tell him to come immediately." The kitchen remained silent. Dr. Yoon was the family's private physician, a man who asked no questions and treated everything from bullet wounds to heart attacks with equal discretion. He was not typically summoned for the household staff. "Sir," Mrs. Park began carefully, "I can handle this with the first aid supplies. There's no need to trouble Dr. Yoon with a minor injury." Junho's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority that made grown men fear for their lives. "I didn't ask for your opinion, Mrs. Park. I gave you an instruction." "Yes, sir," the housekeeper replied quickly, reaching for the phone with hands that trembled slightly. Junho approached Keisha, moving with the same controlled grace she had observed in the conference room. When he was close enough to examine her injury, he gently took her chin in his hand and tilted her face toward the light. His touch was surprisingly gentle, and Keisha found herself holding her breath as he assessed the damage. "This needs stitches," he said, speaking more to himself than to anyone in the room. "You could have been killed if that chandelier had hit you directly." "I'm sorry, sir," Keisha whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. For being in the wrong place, for bleeding in his kitchen, for requiring medical attention that cost money and created complications. "You have nothing to apologize for," he replied, his tone gentler than she had ever heard it. "Accidents happen during situations like this. The important thing is getting you proper treatment." Dr. Yoon arrived within 20 minutes, carrying the same black medical bag he brought for family emergencies. He examined Keisha's wound with professional efficiency, cleaning the cut and determining that it would indeed require several stitches to heal properly. Throughout the procedure, Junho remained in the room, watching the doctor work with an attention that seemed far beyond what the situation warranted. When the treatment was finished, Keisha expected to be dismissed back to her regular duties. Instead, Junho instructed Mrs. Park to arrange a guest room for her recovery, explaining that she shouldn't be working until the stitches were removed. The housekeeper's shocked expression mirrored Keisha's own confusion. Guest rooms were for family and important visitors, not injured staff members. "That's very generous, sir," Keisha said carefully, "but I can rest in the staff quarters. I don't want to be any trouble." "It's not about what you want," Junho replied, but his tone wasn't harsh. "It's about doing what's necessary for your recovery. Dr. Yoon recommends rest and minimal activity for the next few days." As the household staff dispersed and normal routines resumed, Keisha found herself being escorted to a guest room that was larger and more luxurious than any space she had ever occupied. The four-poster bed alone was worth more than her family's entire living room set, and the attached bathroom featured marble fixtures and amenities that belonged in a luxury hotel. That evening, as she sat propped up against silk pillows with a bandage covering the left side of her face, Junho knocked on her door. When she called for him to enter, he stepped into the room carrying a tea service on a silver tray, an act of domestic care that seemed completely at odds with his reputation as one of Seoul's most dangerous men. "You should eat something," he said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "Dr. Yoon said you lost more blood than was ideal." "Thank you, sir," she replied, still unsure how to respond to his unexpected kindness. "This is all very generous, but I should mention that I can't afford to pay for medical treatment or extended time off work." Junho studied her face, his expression unreadable. "Tell me about your father's medical situation," he said. "Mrs. Park mentioned that you send most of your wages home to America." And for the first time since arriving at the Lee compound, Keisha found herself explaining her circumstances to someone who seemed genuinely interested in listening. For 2 days, Keisha had remained in the guest room, recovering from her injury while trying to understand the shift in her circumstances. The other staff members brought her meals with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, as if her sudden elevation to guest status might be contagious. Mrs. Park checked on her medical progress with clinical efficiency, but there was something guarded in the older woman's manner, a careful distance that suggested she was waiting for this unusual situation to resolve itself. On the third morning, Junho appeared at her door carrying a breakfast tray himself, an act so unprecedented that Keisha wondered if she was hallucinating from the pain medication Dr. Yoon had prescribed. He was dressed in his usual impeccable suit, charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. But his demeanor was less formal than she had come to expect. "How are you feeling?" he asked, setting the tray on the small table by the window. The bandage on her face had been reduced to a smaller dressing, and the stitches were healing cleanly according to Dr. Yoon's latest examination. "Much better, thank you," she replied, still uncertain about the proper protocol for this situation. "I should be able to return to work tomorrow, if Mrs. Park has assignments for me." "That's what I wanted to discuss with you," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. "I have a proposition that might interest you." The word proposition carried weight in the Lee household, where business arrangements were often matters of life and death. Keisha set down her teacup and gave him her full attention, sensing that this conversation would be more important than any medical discussion about her recovery. "You mentioned that you were studying nursing before you came to work here," he continued. "That you left school because of your father's medical expenses." "Yes, sir. Pancreatic cancer. The treatment costs more than our insurance covers, and the experimental therapies aren't covered at all." Junho nodded, his expression thoughtful. "How much does he need for complete treatment, including the experimental options his doctors have recommended?" The question was so direct that it took Keisha a moment to process what he was asking. "The total amount, including the treatments we can't afford, would be around $200,000 over the next 2 years. And how much are you currently able to send him from your wages here?" "About $800 a month, after my own living expenses." "It's not nearly enough." Junho leaned back in his chair, studying her face with the same careful assessment she had witnessed during their previous encounters. When he spoke again, his tone was formal, businesslike, as if he were conducting a negotiation with a rival family rather than talking to his injured maid. "I have a position available that would solve your financial concerns permanently," he said. "Personal assistant to handle my private affairs. The salary would be $75,000 annually, plus comprehensive medical coverage that would extend to your father's treatment. Additionally, I would cover his current medical debt in full as a signing bonus." Keisha felt the air leave her lungs. The amount he was discussing represented more money than her family had ever possessed, enough to not only save her father's life, but to completely transform their circumstances. But she had learned during her time with the Lee family that generosity of this magnitude always came with a price. "What would this position involve?" she asked carefully. "You would handle my personal correspondence, manage my private schedule, coordinate with Dr. Yoon for medical matters, and ensure the smooth operation of my personal affairs." You would live here on the estate in proper quarters, not staff housing. You would report directly to me, not to Mrs. Park or any other household manager. The terms sounded almost too good to be true, which in Keisha's experience usually meant they were exactly that. She had spent enough time in the criminal underworld to understand that nothing was ever as simple as it appeared on the surface. And in exchange for this position, what would you expect from me beyond the duties you've described? Junho's expression became more serious, his dark eyes holding her gaze with uncomfortable intensity. Absolute loyalty, he said. Complete discretion regarding everything you see and hear in this household. The understanding that once you accept this arrangement, my protection extends to you and your family, but betrayal would have permanent consequences for both of you. The threat was delivered in the same calm tone he used for everything else, but Keisha felt the chill of genuine danger. She was being offered salvation for her father and security for herself, but she was also being asked to bind herself to a man whose business was built on violence and fear. Why me, she asked. You could hire someone with actual experience as a personal assistant. Someone who understands your world better than I do. For the first time since entering the room, Junho's controlled facade seemed to crack slightly. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that she hadn't heard before. I had a younger sister, he said. Junhee. She was 5 years younger than me, kind and gentle in ways that didn't fit our family's business. When I was building the organization, expanding our territory, and establishing our reputation, she fell in love with a man who seemed charming and successful. He paused, his hands tightening almost imperceptibly on the arms of his chair. I was too busy consolidating power to pay attention to the signs that he was abusive, too focused on external threats to notice the internal one destroying someone I loved. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. Keisha felt something cold settle in her stomach. What happened to her? He killed her during what the police called a domestic dispute, Junho continued, his voice becoming even more controlled. Made it look like an accident. I had all the power and resources in the world, controlled territory that stretched across 3 countries, and I couldn't protect the one person who mattered most to me. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Keisha understood now why her injury had prompted such an unprecedented response, why he had noticed her bruised face during their first real conversation, why he was offering her a way out of circumstances that paralleled his sister's situation. You think I'm in danger, she said. I think you're a good person trying to survive in circumstances beyond your control, he replied. I think you're intelligent enough to understand what I'm offering and practical enough to recognize that you don't have better options available. He wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. $800 a month would never be enough to save her father's life, and her chances of finding higher-paying employment without a completed education were minimal. But accepting his offer would mean entering his world fully, becoming part of an organization that operated outside the law and settling disputes with violence. If I refuse, she asked, then you continue working as a maid, sending what money you can to your father, and hoping that somehow the situation improves before it's too late. I would respect your decision and ensure that you face no consequences for declining. And if I accept, then your father receives the best medical care available, your financial concerns become irrelevant, and you gain the protection of someone who has learned the cost of failing to protect people he cares about. Keisha stared out the window at the manicured grounds of the estate, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. Her father could live, not just survive, but thrive, with access to treatments that were currently impossible dreams. She could finish her education if she chose to, or build a different kind of life entirely. But she would be trading her independence for security, accepting a gilded cage in exchange for her family's salvation. What if I wanted to leave eventually, she asked. If I completed my obligations, or if circumstances changed. The terms would be negotiated at that time based on the situation, he said. But I should be clear that once you accept my protection, once you become part of my household in this capacity, leaving becomes complicated. There are security considerations that don't exist for regular employees. She understood. There would be no clean exit from this arrangement, no simple resignation letter that would end her connection to the Lee family's business. She would know too much, have seen too much, been too close to operations that required absolute secrecy. The moral weight of the decision pressed down on her like a physical thing. She would be accepting money that came from criminal enterprises, aligning herself with an organization that used fear and violence to maintain its power. But her father was dying, and this was the only realistic path to saving his life. You don't have to decide immediately, Junho said, rising from his chair with the same controlled grace that marked all his movements. Think about what I've offered. Consider your alternatives. When you're ready to give me an answer, let Mrs. Park know and she'll arrange a meeting. He moved toward the door, then paused as if remembering something important. One more thing, Keisha. If you accept this position, you should understand that I take care of what belongs to me. Your safety, your father's medical care, your family's security, these would become my personal responsibility. I don't make commitments lightly, and I don't break the ones I make. After he left, Keisha remained at the table, staring at the breakfast he had brought her while trying to comprehend the choice she was being asked to make. Outside her window, she could see the estate's gardens stretching toward the high walls that separated this world of luxury and danger from the ordinary reality she had always known. Her father was dying. She had no other options that offered any real hope of changing that fact. Lee Junho was offering her the power to save the most important person in her life, but the price would be her own freedom and quite possibly her soul. She thought about nursing school, about the dream of helping people that had driven her to choose that profession in the first place. She thought about her father's last phone call, when he had tried to sound optimistic while describing treatment options they couldn't afford. She thought about 18 months of cleaning floors while men discussed territory and violence as casually as other people talked about the weather. Maybe morality was a luxury that people in her circumstances couldn't afford. Maybe sometimes love required compromise with principles that seemed absolute until survival was at stake. 2 hours later, she asked Mrs. Park to arrange a meeting with Lee Junho. When he arrived at her room that afternoon, she was sitting by the window with her hands folded in her lap and her decision made. "I accept your offer," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to. For the first time since she had known him, Lee Junho smiled. 3 months after accepting Junho's proposition, Keisha had settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible during her days as a maid in the estate's lower quarters. Her new accommodations occupied the entire east wing of the second floor, a suite of rooms that included a spacious bedroom, a private sitting area, and a fully equipped office where she managed the intricate details of Lee Junho's personal affairs. The transformation in her circumstances was so complete that she sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life. Her father's medical treatments were proceeding better than his doctors had dared hope, funded by the comprehensive insurance policy that Junho had arranged within days of her acceptance. The experimental therapies that had once seemed impossibly expensive were now routine parts of his care plan, and the latest reports suggested that the cancer was responding to treatment. Keisha's daily responsibilities bore little resemblance to the menial tasks that had defined her previous role in the household. She coordinated Junho's personal appointments, managed his correspondence with family members and legitimate business associates, and served as a liaison with Dr. Yoon for medical matters that required absolute discretion. The work demanded intelligence and judgment rather than physical labor, and she found herself using skills she hadn't realized she possessed. Her office overlooked the estate's gardens, where she could observe the daily rhythms of the household from a new perspective. The other staff members treated her with a deference that still felt strange, understanding that her position in the hierarchy had fundamentally changed. Mrs. Park, who had once supervised her every movement, now sought her approval for household matters that might affect Junho's schedule or comfort. The morning routine had evolved into a carefully choreographed dance of efficiency and mutual respect. Keisha would arrive at Junho's private study at 8 o'clock precisely, carrying his coffee and the daily briefing materials she had prepared. They would review his schedule, discuss any correspondence that required his attention, and coordinate the complex logistics of running an organization that operated both legitimate businesses and less conventional enterprises. During these morning meetings, she had begun to see aspects of his personality that existed beyond the cold control he projected to the world. He possessed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of classical music and would occasionally comment on pieces playing softly in the background during their work sessions. His questions about her father's treatment revealed a genuine understanding of medical terminology and treatment protocols that seemed incongruous with his primary occupation. When discussing legitimate business matters, his insights demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that could have made him successful in any field he chose to pursue. One particular morning, Keisha was organizing files related to a shipping contract when she noticed him watching her through the study window. He was in the garden speaking with Mr. Choi, the elderly groundskeeper who had maintained the estate's landscaping for over 20 years. The conversation appeared to be about the care of the ancient cherry trees that line the main pathway, but what struck her was the patience and respect in Junho's manner as he listened to the older man's recommendations. The same person who could silence a room full of dangerous men with a single glance was nodding thoughtfully while an elderly gardener explained the optimal timing for pruning branches. When Mr. Choi finished speaking, Junho placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, a gesture of affection that seemed completely natural despite the vast difference in their positions within the household hierarchy. That evening, during their usual review of the day's business, Keisha found herself asking about the interaction she had witnessed. "You seemed very interested in Mr. Choi's gardening advice," she said. "Do you spend much time working on the grounds yourself?" Junho looked up from the financial reports he was reviewing, his expression mildly amused by her curiosity. "Mr. Choi taught me to appreciate plants when I was a child," he said. "My father thought gardening was a waste of time for someone in our family's business. But Mr. Choi showed me that creating something beautiful requires the same patience and attention to detail as any other worthwhile endeavor." It was the first truly personal information he had shared about his childhood, and Keisha felt honored to be trusted with the insight into his early life. She had learned to recognize these moments when his carefully maintained walls showed small cracks, revealing glimpses of the person he might have been under different circumstances. Their evening conversations had gradually evolved beyond strictly business matters. After completing the day's administrative tasks, they would often remain in his study discussing topics that ranged from current events to philosophy to her observations about the household dynamics. Junho seemed genuinely interested in her perspectives, asking questions that suggested he valued her intelligence rather than simply tolerating her presence. It was during one of these conversations that he discovered her collection of medical journals. She had been reading an article about new cancer treatment protocols when he entered the study carrying tea for both of them, a domestic gesture that had become part of their routine. Instead of the financial documents she usually had spread across the desk, he found medical research papers covered with her careful notes and highlighted passages. "Are these related to your father's treatment?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Some of them," she replied, "but I also like to keep up with advances in the field. I suppose old habits are hard to break." "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The nursing program, I mean." The question caught her off guard with its directness. She had spent months trying not to think about the career she had abandoned, focusing instead on the immediate necessity of her father's survival and her new responsibilities. But his question forced her to confront feelings she had carefully buried. "Every day," she admitted. "I love the idea of helping people, of using medical knowledge to make a real difference in their lives. But given the circumstances, I made the only choice I could make." Junho was quiet for several moments, his dark eyes thoughtful as he considered her words. "What if I told you that choice doesn't have to be permanent?" he said finally. 2 weeks later, Keisha found herself enrolled as an audit student in advanced medical courses at Seoul National University. Junho had arranged everything through contacts who asked no questions about her unusual circumstances or the source of her tuition payments. She would attend classes 2 afternoons per week, fitting her education around her responsibilities as his personal assistant. The gesture represented more than just academic opportunity. It demonstrated that he saw her as a complete person with dreams and aspirations that extended beyond her utility to his organization. The recognition that she deserved to pursue her own goals, even while serving his needs, felt like a gift she hadn't dared to expect. As autumn progressed into winter, Keisha noticed subtle changes in their dynamic that reflected growing trust and mutual respect. She spoke more freely during their conversations, offering opinions and observations without the careful deference that had characterized her early weeks in the position. He shared details about family history and personal preferences that painted a more complex picture of the man behind the reputation. She learned that he spoke 4 languages fluently, that he had earned a degree in international business before circumstances forced him to focus on the family's traditional enterprises, and that he maintained correspondence with former classmates who had pursued conventional careers in banking and corporate law. The life he had chosen was not the only life available to him, which somehow made his dedication to protecting his family's interests more significant. The first real test of their evolved relationship came on a cold December evening when Captain Kim burst into the study without his usual formal announcement. "Sir," he said, his professional composure cracked by urgency, "we have confirmed movement from the Huang faction. Intelligence suggests they're planning something significant within the next 48 hours. Keisha had learned enough about the family's business to understand the implications. The Huang organization had been testing the boundaries of Li territory for months, probing for weaknesses and opportunities to expand their own influence. A significant move from them could mean anything from a coordinated business disruption to an armed assault on the estate itself. Junho's transformation was immediate and complete. The relaxed, contemplative man who had been discussing university coursework with her moments before became the cold, calculating leader whose reputation inspired fear throughout Seoul's underworld. His instructions to Captain Kim were precise and comprehensive, covering everything from increased security protocols to evacuation procedures for non-essential personnel. But even as he shifted into crisis management mode, his attention remained partially focused on her safety. "Keisha," he said, turning to address her directly, "you'll move to the secure quarters on the 3rd floor until this situation is resolved. Captain Kim will assign 2 guards to ensure your safety." The assumption that her protection was his responsibility, that her safety was as important as any other strategic consideration, revealed how completely their relationship had evolved. She was no longer an employee who happened to work in a dangerous environment. She was someone under his personal protection, someone whose welfare was integrated into his decision-making process. "I can handle myself," she said, though she appreciated the concern. "I've been living in this world long enough to understand the precautions." "This isn't a discussion," he replied, but his tone carried more concern than authority. "The Huang family doesn't distinguish between combatants and civilians when they make their moves. Until we know their specific intentions, you stay where I know you're safe." The next 48 hours passed in a state of controlled tension that permeated the entire estate. Security patrols were doubled, staff members not essential to operations were given temporary leave, and the household settled into the kind of defensive posture that had served the Li family through decades of territorial conflicts. Keisha remained in the secure quarters as instructed, but Junho visited her several times each day to provide updates and ensure her comfort. During one of these visits, as they sat in the heavily reinforced room that served as both safe house and temporary prison, Keisha realized that something fundamental had shifted in how she viewed their arrangement. This wasn't simply employment with unusual benefits or a temporary alliance based on mutual convenience. She had become someone important to him, someone whose welfare mattered beyond her utility to his organization. The Huang situation ultimately resolved through negotiation rather than violence, their probe having served its purpose of testing Li defenses and gathering intelligence about potential vulnerabilities. But the crisis had revealed the extent to which Keisha had become integrated into Junho's world and priorities. As normal routines resumed and the heightened security measures were gradually relaxed, she found herself looking forward to their daily interactions with an anticipation that went beyond professional obligation. The man who controlled territory and commanded respect through fear was also someone who brought her tea in the evening, who remembered details about her university classes, and who had ensured her safety was his primary concern during potential danger. She was no longer just surviving in Li Junho's world. She was becoming part of it, and perhaps more significantly, he was becoming part of hers. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday morning when the estate was at its most vulnerable, during the shift change between night and day security teams. Keisha was in her office reviewing correspondence when the first explosions shattered the winter silence, followed immediately by the staccato burst of automatic weapons fire that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. This was not the probing assault they had experienced months earlier. This was a coordinated military-style operation designed to breach the estate's defenses and eliminate specific targets. Through her office window, Keisha could see smoke rising from the main gatehouse and dark figures moving through the gardens with tactical precision that spoke of professional training and extensive preparation. The estate's emergency protocols activated within seconds. Steel shutters descended over every window, transforming the luxurious mansion into a fortress designed to withstand sustained assault. The intercom system crackled to life, with Captain Kim's voice issuing terse commands in Korean, coordinating defensive positions and evacuation procedures with the efficiency of someone who had planned for exactly this scenario. But even as the household shifted into crisis mode, Keisha understood with growing horror that this attack was different from previous territorial disputes. The assault teams weren't simply testing defenses or sending a message about boundaries. They were searching for something specific, and from the fragments of shouted Korean she could understand that something was her. "Find the Don's woman," one of the attackers yelled from somewhere near the main entrance. "The boss wants her alive." The words sent ice through her veins as she realized the full implications of her relationship with Junho. She was no longer simply an employee who happened to work in a dangerous environment. She had become a target in her own right, a vulnerability that enemies could exploit to strike at the heart of the Lee family's operations. The heavy footsteps in the corridor outside her office indicated that the attackers had breached the main house despite the security measures designed to prevent exactly that outcome. Keisha pressed herself against the reinforced wall beside her desk, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give away her location to anyone who came looking. The office door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and smoke. 3 men in tactical gear swept into the room, weapons raised and eyes scanning for targets. They moved with military precision, checking corners and potential hiding spots with the methodical thoroughness of professional soldiers rather than common criminals. "Where is she?" the lead attacker demanded in accented English, apparently having identified her office from intelligence gathered before the assault. "We know the Korean keeps an American woman here. Tell us where she is and nobody else has to die." Keisha remained motionless behind her desk, knowing that discovery would mean either death or something worse depending on what her captors had planned. The seconds stretched like hours as the men searched the room, overturning furniture and checking behind curtains while she tried to control her breathing enough to avoid detection. The sound of approaching gunfire from the corridor suggested that Captain Kim's security team was mounting a counterattack, fighting their way through the house to reach the areas where the family's most important people might be trapped. But even if they succeeded in repelling the assault, the damage had already been done. The Lee family's enemies now understood that Keisha represented a weakness they could exploit. The office window exploded inward as another team of attackers attempted to breach the room from outside. Glass and debris filled the air while Keisha pressed herself flatter against the floor, trying to become invisible while chaos erupted around her. She could hear Junho's voice somewhere in the distance, shouting orders and coordinating the defense with the same controlled authority she had witnessed during their first encounter in the conference room. But there was something different in his tone, an edge of desperation that she had never heard before. He wasn't just defending his territory or protecting his organization. He was fighting to reach her, and the knowledge that she was in danger was affecting his judgment in ways that could compromise the entire defensive operation. The attackers in her office were systematically destroying everything, looking for hiding places or clues about her location. One of them kicked over her desk, sending her carefully organized files flying while she remained pressed against the wall just feet away. Discovery seemed inevitable until the door frame filled with a figure that made all 3 attackers freeze. Junho stood in the doorway like vengeance personified, his expensive suit torn and blood-stained, but his dark eyes burning with cold fury. He held a pistol in each hand, and his presence filled the room with the kind of lethal intensity that had built his reputation throughout Seoul's underworld. "You're in my house," he said quietly, his voice carrying more threat than a shouted challenge. "You're looking for something that belongs to me." The lead attacker raised his weapon, but Junho moved with inhuman speed. 2 shots echoed through the room, and both armed men collapsed before they could return fire. The third attacker, apparently realizing that surrender was his only option for survival, dropped his weapon and raised his hands. Whereas Keisha, Junho demanded, his attention focused entirely on extracting information from the surviving intruder. His voice carried the promise of unimaginable consequences for anyone who had harmed her. "Safe room," she called out, emerging from her hiding place behind the overturned desk. "I'm here. I'm all right." The transformation in his expression was immediate and profound. The cold killer who had eliminated 2 armed attackers without hesitation became someone overwhelmed with relief and desperate concern. He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her against him with a force that spoke of emotions too powerful for his usual controlled demeanor. "I thought I was too late," he murmured against her hair, his voice shaking slightly despite his efforts to maintain composure. "When I heard them asking for you, when I realized they knew about our arrangement, I thought I had failed you the way I failed my sister." The gunfire throughout the house was subsiding as Captain Kim's team succeeded in neutralizing the remaining attackers. But even as the immediate threat diminished, Keisha could feel the tension in Junho's body, the way his hands trembled slightly as he held her. This assault had shaken him in ways that previous attacks on his territory never had. "They came here because of me," she said, the guilt settling over her like a weight. "Because I accepted your protection, because I became part of your household, I made you vulnerable to this kind of attack." "No," he replied firmly, his hands framing her face so she had to meet his eyes. "They came because our enemies are cowards who attack what matters to people rather than facing them directly. They came because you matter to me, and they thought that made you a weakness they could exploit." "Do I?" she asked quietly. "Matter to you, I mean?" The question seemed to break something inside him that had been carefully held in place by years of discipline and emotional control. When he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she had never heard before. "You matter more than anything in my world," he said. "More than territory or reputation or power. When I thought they might have taken you, when I realized I might lose you the way I lost Junhee, I understood that nothing else I've built means anything without you here to share it." The admission hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. Everything about their relationship had been built on practical necessity, on mutual benefit, and carefully defined roles. But what he was describing went far beyond professional arrangement or even protective obligation. "I can't lose you too," he continued, his forehead resting against hers. "I won't survive it again. You've become everything good in my life, everything that makes the darkness bearable. You're mine to protect, mine to cherish, mine to love." The possession in his voice should have frightened her. 6 months ago, being claimed by a crime boss would have seemed like a nightmare scenario. But standing in the ruins of her office, surrounded by evidence of how far he would go to ensure her safety, she realized that his protection had become as essential to her as breathing. "I'm yours," she whispered, the words carrying more weight than any formal contract or negotiated arrangement. "Whatever that means, however complicated it makes everything, I'm yours." His response was immediate and overwhelming. He kissed her with desperate intensity. Months of carefully controlled attraction and growing emotional connection finally released from the constraints of their professional relationship. She responded with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair, while they acknowledged what had been building between them since the morning she had spilled cleaning supplies in his conference room. When they finally separated, both breathing hard and shaken by the magnitude of what had just shifted between them, Keisha noticed blood seeping through his torn shirt from what appeared to be a knife wound along his ribs. The sight of his injury brought out protective instincts she hadn't known she possessed. "You're hurt," she said, her training as a nursing student automatically taking precedence over everything else. "Sit down and let me look at that wound." "It's nothing serious," he protested, but he allowed her to guide him to the chair that had somehow survived the destruction of her office. Just a graze from one of their blades. As she carefully examined the injury, cleaning it with supplies from the first aid kit that was standard equipment in every room of the estate, she felt the intimacy of caring for him in this vulnerable moment. His powerful body, usually so controlled and intimidating, was warm and solid under her gentle touch. "This needs proper stitches," she said, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. "Dr. Yun should look at it." "Later," he replied, his hand covering hers as she worked. "Right now, I just want to hold you and know that you're safe." Outside, Captain Kim was coordinating cleanup and assessing damage while the surviving attackers were prepared for interrogation. The assault had been repelled, but everyone understood that this was only the beginning of a larger conflict that would reshape the balance of power in Seoul's criminal landscape. But in the destroyed office where their relationship had begun as employer and employee, Keisha and Junho held each other with the desperate intensity of people who had finally acknowledged that love was worth any risk, any danger, any price their enemies might demand. The cleanup took 3 days, but the consequences of the assault on the Lee estate extended far beyond broken windows and damaged furniture. Within 24 hours of the attack, every member of the organization responsible for targeting Keisha had simply vanished from Seoul, their operations dismantled with the surgical precision that had made Junho's reputation legendary throughout Korea's criminal underworld. Keisha never asked for details about how the threat was eliminated, and Junho never offered them. Some conversations were unnecessary between people who understood the realities of the world they inhabited. What mattered was that the danger had been permanently removed, and the message sent to any other organizations considering similar tactics was unmistakable. On the 4th morning after the attack, Keisha woke in the secure quarters where she had spent the previous nights while repairs were completed throughout the main house. The sun streaming through bulletproof windows illuminated a breakfast tray that hadn't been there when she fell asleep, along with a single white orchid and an envelope bearing her name in Junho's precise handwriting. The letter was brief but formal, written with the same attention to detail he brought to all important business correspondence. It was an invitation to join him for dinner that evening in his private study, with a note that there were matters of mutual interest they needed to discuss. By evening, the estate had returned to its normal rhythm of controlled luxury and barely visible security. Keisha made her way to Junho's study wearing the emerald green dress he had selected for her, understanding that this dinner would be different from their usual evening conversations about schedules and correspondence. He was waiting for her beside the fireplace, dressed in a black suit that emphasized the aristocratic elegance that existed alongside his more dangerous qualities. The study had been transformed for the occasion, with candles replacing the usual harsh lighting and a table set with china that probably cost more than most people's cars. "You look beautiful," he said, moving to pull out her chair with old-fashioned courtesy that seemed natural despite their unconventional circumstances. The dinner itself was perfect, featuring dishes prepared by the chef who normally cooked only for special occasions and important guests. But Keisha could sense an underlying tension in Junho's manner, a formality that suggested he was preparing for a conversation that required careful consideration of every word. "How is your father responding to the latest treatments?" he asked as they finished the main course. "Better than anyone dared hope," she replied. "Dr. Morrison says the experimental therapy is working beyond their most optimistic projections. The tumors are shrinking, and his overall health is improving dramatically." "I'm glad," Junho said, and she could hear genuine satisfaction in his voice. "Your family's well-being has always been important to me." There was something in his tone that suggested this topic was leading somewhere specific. Keisha set down her fork and gave him her complete attention, sensing that they were approaching the real purpose of this formal dinner. "Keisha," he continued, his voice taking on the careful precision he used for important negotiations, "these past months have changed everything about how I understand my life and my responsibilities. What happened during the attack made me realize that our current arrangement, however satisfying it has been, isn't sufficient for what I want our future to look like." He paused, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a small velvet box that made Keisha's breath catch in her throat. The implications of what he was about to propose were so enormous that she felt momentarily dizzy. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, opening the box to reveal a diamond ring that caught the candlelight like captured starfire. "Not as a business arrangement or an extension of your current position, but as my wife and the official head of the Lee family household." The ring was extraordinary, clearly custom designed with a level of craftsmanship that spoke of months of planning. But more significant than its obvious value was what the proposal represented. Marriage would transform her from protected employee to family matriarch, giving her legal status and social position that would make her untouchable by any of the Lee family's enemies. "As my wife," he continued, You would have complete authority over all domestic operations, full access to family resources, and the protection that comes with being the most important person in my life. Your father's medical care would be permanent, your family's security guaranteed, and your own future limited only by whatever dreams you choose to pursue. The offer was everything she could have imagined and more. Marriage to Lee Junho would mean safety, luxury, and the power to help her family in ways that went far beyond her father's medical needs. But it would also mean accepting a life where violence was always a possibility, where moral compromise was a daily reality, and where leaving would become impossible. What about nursing school? She asked, testing whether this proposal included space for her own ambitions. Whatever you want, he replied without hesitation. Finish your degree, practice medicine, build your own career, or focus entirely on family responsibilities. The choice would be yours, and I would support whatever decision you make. His willingness to accommodate her dreams, to see marriage as partnership rather than possession, dissolved the last of her reservations. This wasn't a man trying to control her life, but someone offering to build a life together that honored both their needs and aspirations. Yes, she said, extending her hand so he could slip the ring onto her finger. I want to be your wife. The transformation in his expression was immediate and profound. For a moment, the controlled crime boss disappeared entirely, replaced by a man overwhelmed with joy and relief. He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her with gentle intensity while they both processed the magnitude of what they had just committed to. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the estate's garden, transformed for the occasion into something that belonged in a fairy tale rather than the headquarters of a criminal organization. Keisha's family flew in from America, her father looking healthier than he had in 2 years thanks to the treatments that had become possible through Junho's intervention. The ceremony itself blended Korean and American traditions, reflecting the cultural bridge their marriage represented. Keisha wore a traditional Korean hanbok for the formal ceremony, then changed into a white Western wedding dress for the reception. The guest list included legitimate businessmen, family friends, and carefully selected associates who understood that this event marked a new chapter in the Lee family's operations. Her father walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, understanding that this marriage had quite literally saved his life, while giving his daughter the kind of security and happiness he had never dared hope for her. When Junho took her hand at the altar, promising to love and protect her for the rest of their lives, Keisha felt the completion of a journey that had begun with a spilled cleaning cart and evolved into something she couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. The months that followed were a period of adjustment and growing confidence as Keisha settled into her role as the lady of the house. She discovered that managing a household of this size and complexity required skills she hadn't known she possessed, but the staff who had once seen her as just another maid now looked to her for guidance and leadership. More importantly, her marriage had given her the security to pursue her interrupted education with renewed focus. She completed her nursing degree through a combination of university courses and practical experience gained by working with Dr. Yoon on medical matters that required absolute discretion. The irony that her education was being completed in service to a criminal organization wasn't lost on her, but she had learned that moral absolutes were luxuries that people in her situation couldn't afford. A year after their wedding, Keisha stood in the renovated office that had once been the site of the attack that changed everything between them. The room had been rebuilt and redesigned, but she had insisted on keeping the same view of the gardens where she could watch Junho's daily conversation with Mr. Choi about the care and feeding of plants that would outlive them all. The walls of her office now displayed 2 framed documents that represented the different aspects of her transformed life. Her nursing degree hung beside a family photograph from their wedding day, both dreams fulfilled in ways that had required compromise with principles she once thought were absolute. Her father called every Sunday from Phoenix, where he was living in comfortable retirement funded by investments that Junho had arranged through legitimate business channels. His latest medical reports showed no sign of cancer, and his doctors were beginning to use words like complete remission and full recovery that had once seemed impossibly optimistic. Mrs. Park knocked on her office door, entering with the afternoon correspondence that required her review and signature. The dynamic between them had evolved into mutual respect based on their shared commitment to maintaining the household's complex operations. Keisha had learned to command authority without cruelty, while Mrs. Park had adapted to serving someone who understood the realities of their world from experience rather than assumption. "Ma'am," Mrs. Park said, placing the papers on her desk, "your husband asked me to let you know that dinner will be delayed this evening. He's meeting with representatives from the Busan Shipping Consortium about expanding legitimate operations in the southern ports." "Thank you, Mrs. Park," Keisha replied. "Please let him know I'll be in the garden with Mr. Choi when he's finished. I want to discuss the spring planting schedule." As the housekeeper left, Keisha reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. 18 months earlier, she had been an invisible maid desperately sending money home to pay for medical treatments her family couldn't afford. Now she was the wife of one of the most powerful men in Asia, living in luxury she could never have imagined, with the security to pursue dreams that had seemed permanently destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. The moral compromises were real, and she thought about them every day. The money that funded her father's treatment and her own education came from enterprises that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal. The protection that allowed her to live without fear was maintained through methods that would horrify people who lived in more conventional circumstances. But love had never been a simple calculation of right and wrong. It was about finding someone whose presence made life bearable, whose devotion justified whatever prices had to be paid, whose protection created space for dreams that couldn't survive on their own. Through the window, she could see Junho returning from his meeting, moving across the garden with the controlled grace that had first caught her attention in a conference room that seemed like it belonged to someone else's life. When he spotted her watching him, he smiled with the same warmth he had shown during their first dinner as husband and wife. She was no longer invisible in the Lee household. She was the most important person in it, the center around which everything else revolved. From cleaning floors to commanding respect, from sending desperate money home to ensuring her family's permanent security, from hiding behind a cleaning cart to standing beside the most dangerous man in Seoul as his equal partner. The transformation was complete, and for the first time since accepting his original proposition, Keisha understood that she had made the right choice. Sometimes love required accepting imperfection, embracing moral complexity, and building happiness in places where conventional wisdom said it couldn't exist. But as Junho entered her office and pulled her into his arms for the kiss that ended every one of their days together, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged.